Greetings, friends. I felt like making a video today. I felt a bit more energized. No, I didn't have any caffeine, so that's a good thing. And I want to talk today about property and why we don't really own it in Canada. So let me say at the outset that there are 6 basic requirements of men in the West, and indeed in many places outside the West. Now, historically, these were basically get married, join the army when you're called on, and you have to pay taxes. And I'll discuss more about that. But then in recent times, it got a bit more complicated, and we're still required to get married. And we have the military thing, that's kind of gone away. We generally have specialized militaries these days. Sure, there could be a draft if a big war starts again, but that hasn't been something we've seen well, really over half a century. It could happen, but basically get married and then buy property. Now that could mean taking out a mortgage, doesn't mean you're a full owner, as I'll be discussing. And also you have to pay taxes. That would be the third thing. The fourth thing would be deposit your currency in a major bank or a major investment company. So those two things are related. And then the final thing would be self-censorship. Right? In the past, there was censorship too. There would have been some self-censorship when you're in the church. The church would have exerted more influence. But generally, people were living in a rural society. There wasn't this sort of state technological apparatus bearing down on us that could shut down our YouTube channels, because those things didn't exist back then. So conversely, ideas traveled less quickly and less freely back then. It was harder for ideas to spread, but there was probably less censorship and more freedom of speech just by the virtue of being in a rural society. There's less control physically there over you. So anyways, I want to focus on how we are required to serve the system in buying property and paying taxes, because when people I know, like my dad or one of my siblings, might say, well, they own, I own property, and I'd say, well, no, you don't. And then they'd say, well, what do you mean? And I mean, you paid what? How? I asked them how much they pay in taxes, and then they tell me what they pay in taxes. So before I discuss the specifics here, let me do a bit of background here, and I want to discuss like what were the first taxes. So originally, the taxes were basically from farmers to their landlord, to their lord or whatever noble was protecting them. So, I mean, I'm going to focus mostly on Western history here, but a lot of this could apply outside the West too, because economics is pretty basic common sense. But taxes for hundreds of years were something you paid generally out of your income. We would understand that today, but produce historically, so part of your wheat, part of your surplus, right? There was as bad as things were in the Middle Ages. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a great time to be alive, but the subsistence produce was left to the farmer necessarily, and generally another. When I say subsistence, I mean what he needs to feed himself and his family and those animals immediately around him that he needs for his own, to do the farm work and to feed them with milk and chickens and stuff like that. That's generally always left for the farmer. I mean, sure, there might be exceptions to this. Certain countries were better than others. I mentioned England being a bit better than France was, and other continental countries historically. And then the farmer would probably, what differed really, well, when I should be saying in England and France, was how much is left over to the farmer. How much does the state take, and how much is left over to him, so he can trade it. He can exchange it freely for anything else he wants. So those would differ, but there would still be some quantity there, right? So this is what taxes originally were. It was a portion of your produce, part of your surplus produce, beyond the subsistence you needed to feed your family and yourself. Now, you could say, oh, well, you can take it even back into pastoral days of like herdsmen who have all these animals. They don't even have fields. They just rely on their meat and their milk of their animals, and I don't know how herds peoples can get by not eating vegetables. So they must have traded or had some way of getting vegetables, or been, semi-farming. But generally, I mean, even in that system, that you can be paying taxes in animals, and taxes were originally paid in cattle, according to the sources I've come across, going back to the ancient Near East. The first, originally taxes would be in cattle. Produce is easier to divide. You can divide bushels of wheat. Dividing a cow, it's like, oh, well, the cow's dead now. So, I mean, eventually we'd have money, which is the most, metal money. We can divide that. It's the most efficient thing to have. So, but I'm just saying, in that system, even in the herdsman system, he would have hundreds of cattle, depending on how successful he is. So, of course, he would lend some of those cattle or give them to the household upon whose family he swore his allegiance, partly for his own protection or partly because, I mean, you had to be with someone back then. You can't be just on your own living in the same society. So you have to pay some tribute there. But it would be, he would have plenty left over for himself, even in these oppressive systems. That's probably, a herdsman would be even more free. I mean, they would be like the Mongols who invaded all across Europe and Asia, and I mean they were, because this is an aside, but the thing is about these herds peoples is they have no natural barriers, they have no natural borders containing them, so it's inherently an unstable system because they can grow up as many animals and get very strong, and then all it takes is one strong warlord to come around and unite them, and they could basically take on any civilized, like they could take on civilized China or Europe. Like no one could stand against them if they got enough of their numbers together. It didn't even matter if they were like not technologically on the same level as the civilizations. There's just too many of them. Anyways, so that was sort of the system for many hundreds of years. You'd give some of your produce to the noble or to the lord or to the king, right? I mean, and then eventually cities got bigger, and then, humans became more urban dwelling and focusing on crafts and producing things that they specialized in, like blacksmiths or barrel makers or candle makers. And we know a lot about how dirty the cities were, like in London in the 1300s, the plague, and how terrible the sanitation was. So you can make an argument, well, the government had to get involved maybe and start taxing people to take care of public works. And yeah, there's an argument there. But again, the other side is, well, private industry can also take care of these things. But whatever, we don't need to argue either way. But I'm just saying that historically, when the cities developed, that's when you started seeing more of this taxation. But really, perhaps you would have to pay a tax to just simply own a dwelling in I don't know, 1600s Amsterdam. It's possible, but generally the taxes, even in Europe in those days, were on income, were on anything. If you were a merchant, you would be taxed on your produce, not on simply living in a house. Now, there could be exceptions to this, I admit, but I mean, certainly not in colonial America. There was nothing like a property tax for a long, long time after the English and Scottish and other European settlers arrived. There was nothing like a property tax for quite a while, and I'll be getting to that. So, when it comes to paying a property tax like we do today, this is sort of a product of the 20th century, and many of these changes came in the early to the middle part of the 20th century, especially during the Depression in the instance of the United States. So this is a bit different because now this has moved to the level in history where you can be taxed just for the right to occupy a dwelling, to supposedly own a dwelling. And that's something that doesn't make sense to me. I think because you can't, if you have to rent something, then you don't own it, right? So like this laptop, this computer is mine because I paid for it. I don't have to give anyone a flow of money to keep using this laptop. It's mine. I own it. So to own is a very simple definition. It's not one of those terms like, oh, it has, different definitions. It can be, like the word pride, that has different definitions. But ownership or owning is just that you have something. It's yours. You're not renting it from anyone else. You don't have to pay tribute for it on any continual basis. Now, that's why we don't own property in most places in Canada. I mean, again, maybe you could find some certain exceptions, but probably this would apply to the United States and much of the Western world today, because you have to pay the government property taxes. So in a city like Toronto, I went to the Ministry of Housing and the Ministry of Municipalities and the provincial government website, and they say that, like they say here, quote, if you own property in Ontario, you receive a property tax bill each year. Typically, your property tax rates are determined by your municipality based on your property value, the municipal tax rate, that could be plural, there could be more than one, and then the education tax rate. I'm not sure what that is. I guess it pays for our education system. And then they give us an example. For example, the tax on a home assessed for 300,000 Canadian dollars would be $3,300 per year. Now, you may say, well, that's not too much. I mean, if you're owning a place like that, then you must have had some income coming in, and surely you can afford, a few $1,000s a year, even though it's $3,300 a year, to the government, because the government's taking care of us and stuff. And sure, that's fine. I mean, I'm not necessarily trying to say there should be no property. I mean, yes, okay, I'll admit I don't think there should be a property tax, but you can argue for one. But then just don't say that you own it. You don't own it. Okay? So I would pay $10,000 a year to rent this place, and that's more than I'd be paying if I own this place. So sure, there's a benefit there, but I just look at those as two different kinds of rent. Sure, this is a bit more expensive, but I'm not tied down here. There's less legal commitments. There's actually other things taken care of, like internet and all that stuff. And I mean, you're going to be paying more for utilities and stuff. I mean, that's not included in the property taxes when you actually own a place. Own, right? I'm making fun of that. When you legally own it, when you buy into it, or when you get a mortgage. Even when you get a mortgage, if you don't fully own it, you might not pay the same taxes. I could be wrong. If you know more how that works, then feel free to offer your insight there. But definitely, that's what you'd be paying. And so $3,300 on 300 grand. And well, that's not actually $300,000 would get you the minimum level of condo, a one-bedroom condo, like a one-bedroom apartment, like a small bedroom, small kitchen, small living area in Toronto, 20 stories up in the sky, in a box, in a glass prism in the sky. And well, I mean, that's still a lot of money, and that's the bare minimum that you can get. That's not a very rosy outlook. So if you want to get an actual house in the suburbs, I mean that's going to cost you way more than $1 million to $1.5 million just for a regular 2 or 3 bedroom house. I can guarantee you it's in that range. I mean, it's a bubble that could pop, but still it's up at that level. And so the property taxes must be double or triple that, or even quadruple that. And that's not including your income taxes and all those other things. It's like this assumption that the state makes that, well, if you're owning a house, then clearly you're serving the system, right? I talked about the different things you're clearly, maybe there would have been other things I could have added there, like working for a big company, working for a corporation. You're not self-employed, you're not an entrepreneur. So maybe, I could have tweaked around those 6 things that the system requires men, I mean specifically men, to serve the system in those ways. But paying taxes and supposedly owning property when you're not owning it, it's an illusion. You're being tricked. Don't buy into it, because then you're going to just renting from the government. That's what's happening in the end. You're just renting from the government. So, I mean, it's a perversion, and I know tax history and taxing, there's this, do a PhD on that, there's books on that, I can go on and on, but so obviously I tried to simplify here And but how basically houses or private dwellings, that a man's house ought to be his castle, no, his refuge, right? And a house is just there for you to have your own shelter, your own peace of mind, ultimately your castle. So a house produces nothing but the fact of sheltering you with a roof and a hearth, well, historically now a furnace, and plumbing and stuff like that. And yeah, I know. I mean, back in the 18th century, they were already taxing like how many windows you have and how many doors, but it was also supposed to say, well, a house with 18 windows is going to have a high income, because only a high income gentleman would own a house with all that glass, and but still there was nothing quite like this property tax that I'm aware of. If you know specific examples, I'm not a full expert here. I'm just I've studied tax history. I've been reading more about capitalism and stuff, so I'm just sharing my insights here the best I can. But a house is not something you can freely exchange. I mean, you can technically, but that's not like a farmer or a herdsman being able to freely exchange some of his surplus produce. We go from surplus produce, which is already there and good to go, to a house where you're living in. That's a bit different. Okay, because you can't just to have to move to sell your house. That's a stressful process usually. It does involve some hardship. So therefore, you're giving up some of your own labor, some of your own peace of mind when you do that. So it's not just something that I think the government should be able to tax. A man's house is his castle, right? So he should be the landlord of his own property. But my landlord has to pay taxes on this house that I'm renting from him. Well, I'm renting part of it. And then, so he's not really the Lord. He's a vassal of the state, in a sense. The state is the real Lord. Because if you stop paying your property taxes, then you'll find out who really owns, your property. If you just stop paying your taxes and see what happens. Right, so that's why I think a house doesn't produce anything like a farm, that it doesn't produce anything you can exchange. It's just there for you. And sure, there's nice houses which are luxurious, but that's why we have services that you have to pay for. You have to pay for water and electricity. You have to pay for that land in the first place. And yeah, if you can get your hands on it, then why not? If you were lucky enough to have the capital to purchase that land, then do it, and then you can own that land, really own it, not have to pay anything for it. And then I think we would have more security in our society, and that would help the economy. People would be guaranteed a rock foundation from which they could build the rest of their careers, build the rest of their life. Historically, that's what it would have been. I mean, the desire to own land was arguably probably the most influential factor driving the settlement of America and Canada, with the early settlers and later the immigrants from Eastern Europe. They wanted land. Okay, they wanted to really actually own land, and not have to be a tenant of anyone else. For most of history, we were just tenants, most of us. So the idea of actually really owning land is kind of still a new idea in history. Maybe that's why it hasn't really managed to succeed for most of us. So where can you own property in the world today? Well, I mean, not really anywhere perfectly, but certainly outside the corrupt West, the declining West, there are places in developing countries where I've talked about this before. I've talked about the advantages of investing in developing countries, so I don't need to go into specifics here. But in Ghana, you can own property without paying any taxes. You pay some taxes at the beginning when you buy the land, when you obtain the land, when you obtain the deed for the land, the legal title of the land with the government. Then you pay some taxes to the government, and they're probably happy to be getting that. It's a source of income to you, because not that most people are more impoverished in that country, like most African countries, so they wouldn't even be in that position in the first place to buy 1 acre or 2 acres of land in a countryside town. So I'm being cynical here, but it's not because the system is necessarily so much more efficient there. It's a more corrupt system in some ways, Western system is corrupt too. It's just the people higher up are corrupt. The peons, the drones, they have to do their job because there's someone looking over their shoulder. But in a place like Ghana, the drones can actually, they can be their own lord, and they can extort you for money. So sure, you have to pay a sum at the beginning, but I don't even think it's that much. I'm not going to go into specifics here, but it's not that much. And then basically you have that land for the rest of your life until you give it away or sell it. Right? So I know there are exceptions out there. And again, I'm not saying you have to go to a developing country to escape the system. But you might want to consider it if you're a young man in North America and you're looking at the future here, because this civilization is stagnating or declining. Whatever it's doing, it ain't advancing anymore. We're not producing any real value, something we can exchange. You know, back in the medieval times, they actually understood that concept, at least producing something that you can, that's real. And today we're with an urban civilization, we don't get that. But if you really want to own something and have that solid foundation, you may have to look to the developing world, unless you're already a millionaire here. Because only in the developing world could you take a relatively small amount of capital and own land. And sure, there'd be disadvantages. You'd have to, the biggest thing is you have to find someone to trust there. But it can be done, and I know there's a pretty cool guy that's been watching my channel. I think he goes by the title No Fucks Given, and that's a cool name. And he's working for an oil company in Nigeria. Like, he's from North America, and he went there and he's living the MGTOW lifestyle. And I say, that's great, man. Keep it up. I wish you all the best there. And I mean, with time, you can get to know more Nigerians, and then you'll be able to figure out who you can trust and who you can't. And then, yeah, you'll be in a good position to, because, you know, I know Nigeria's got a lot of problems, but clearly it's not all that bad there, because clearly they've had a lot of profits in Nigeria from their oil and their resources, and Africa's got a lot of resources. So if you're interested in mining, farming, anything like that, and hey, we aren't evil capitalists, we can actually all benefit and create wealth and make life better for everyone. So let's get out of this dynamic of thinking of, oh, the evil capitalist. No, capitalism is a benefit to everyone. So that's basically what I wanted to say. You can own property in the world, but not in Canada. In Canada, we just rent property from the government, but I suppose we rent it a little less because it's, you know, unlike regular renters, the rate's a bit higher because there's a landlord, middleman. But now there's no middleman if you own the property in Canada, so the rent is lower, but you're not owning it, right? So just to conclude, I'm going to do a video soon about this book, FDR's Folly, and this is by Jim Powell. Sorry if you can see here. Yeah, how Roosevelt, this was in the 30s, Roosevelt and his New Deal prolonged the Great Depression. It's a great book. I'm only halfway through, and so I won't talk too much about it right now, but I'll be coming back to that to give a review, because this is really important information that doesn't get into our textbooks really, doesn't really talked about. How government, through taxation, through many other programs, through intervening in the free market, through just like messing around with humans' regular profitable activities, actually makes things worse for everyone for years. And just to conclude this video, I wanted to tack on one more thing, sort of because I'm talking about economic topics in this video. And so on my recent Bitcoin video, where I was talking about why Bitcoin is a bubble and it's not something you should invest in, but it has some benefits. But one of the things I was saying is it's not backed by anything. The way precious metals, like you have that metal, it's something real. I mean, you can argue like fiat currency isn't really backed by anything too, but it is backed by a paper dollar. Theoretically, you should be able to get that, and even if it's just paper, then it still is exchangeable. But Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. It's like a stock that can go to zero. But one comment, and it wasn't a disrespectful comment, but this person was more optimistic, and they said, well, Bitcoin is backed. It is backed by hardware, because obviously there's a technological system, and there would microchips, or there's some technical developments in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency technology, and that's what's backing it. Well, nice try, man. That's cool. I mean, but I don't agree with you there. What do you guys think? I don't really. That doesn't sound right to me because if you're saying that Bitcoin is backed by hardware, I mean, to me that's like saying like, let's say you own stock, you own shares in a company like American Airlines, and for some reason they have problems. The stock goes to zero, and you're like, well, I want out. And so I want to trade in my stock for yeah, give me some of this airplane, like give me some of the fuselage, because my stock was several $1,000s worth. So this aluminum, give me this pipe. I mean that's kind of what it's like saying that if Bitcoin is backed by hardware, how would you claim the hardware if you wanted to do that? Because that's what you have to do if something is backed by something. You have to be able to exchange it for something else later. You have to get something real out of it. So you wouldn't be able to do that with an airplane if you own stocks in American Airlines and you want it out. The only thing you can do is trade your shares to someone else. That's all you can do. And that's all for now. Hasta luego, amigos.